Right, good evening, everyone. It's absolutely wonderful to see such a great turnout on this kind of miserable, gloomy, dark, rainy day. To have so many people turn up for a philosophy lecture is wonderful, and testament, of course, to the quality of speaker that we have today. So you're all very, very welcome to this Royal Institute of Philosophy lecture. The Royal Institute of Philosophy is an organisation committed to kind of getting philosophy out into the public domain, and we have 2 lectures every year here at York. We're one of the affiliates of the Royal Institute, and we're always delighted when we get a crowd. As I think this might be one of the largest crowds that we've had. So it's wonderful to see people here, especially if you don't maybe come to that many things at the university. We hope that you'll be coming back to other things in the future as well, and I'm sure you will be after today. So I'm delighted to be able to introduce our speaker today, Professor Michael Rosen of Harvard University. I first met Michael 27 years ago when I was an undergraduate. And Michael was teaching an MPhil seminar on the political theories of Hegel and Marx, teaching it along with Jerry Cohen. And I was a sort of a slightly nervous undergrad, and I wasn't quite sure whether I was allowed to attend. So I sort of went along early to the first meeting, and I said, "Oh, would it be okay if I came along?" And don't worry, I won't interrupt things. I'll be very quiet, and I'll just sit at the back, and I'll be no bother. And they very kindly allowed me to do that, and that was a wonderful intellectual experience almost 30 years ago. So it's lovely now to be in this position of welcoming Michael to York. Michael, of course, has got links to Yorkshire and to Harrogate and to York. So wonderful to be welcoming him here today. Michael is the author of 4 books, I think that's right: Hegel's Dialectic and its Criticism, On Voluntary Servitude, False Consciousness and the Theory of Ideology, a 3rd book, Dignity, Its History and Meaning, and his most recent book and largest and most ambitious book, the book he'll be talking about today, The Shadow of God, Kant, Hegel, and the Passage from Heaven to History. And it's an incredibly rich intellectual feast. There's a huge amount in this book. It's got kind of pyrotechnic levels of erudition and learning that those of us with a much narrower range can only sort of look in awestruck admiration at. And so Michael's going to be attempting to do the almost impossible today, to give a sense of the philosophical riches that are there in that book. So just to say a little something about our format today. So first of all, Michael will be giving a sort of quick overview to some of the main ideas in the book. We'll then move to a middle section where my colleague Dr. James Clark, who is a senior lecturer here at York and our expert on Kantian and post-Kantian philosophy here at York, will have a period where there's an interview with Michael where they'll discuss some of the ideas of the book, and then after that we'll throw things open to a general Q&A where there can be a broader discussion, and you can ask Michael questions and we can have a general discussion. So that's the format for today, and without further ado I'll hand over to Michael Rosen. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Martin, and of course I'm absolutely thrilled to be here. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you to James for agreeing to be an interlocutor. Thank you to the Royal Institute of Philosophy, but most of all, thank you all for turning out on an evening where I suppose you weren't likely to be sitting out in the cafes and squares of York, but even so, it's very gratifying to see you. And as Martin said, this is a book. It took me a long time to write. I gave some lectures in Oxford on which it's based in February 2012, so that was 12 years. But in fact, it's probably the culmination it's a tutorial essay I didn't write as an undergraduate and has been postponing and extending ever since. So I've been thinking about these things for a long time. And that has its disadvantages and its advantages, I hope. But one thing I've noticed since publishing the book in the summer is that people have remarked that it points in different directions, that it raises issues that are interesting, and that people want to take the places that people wish I'd said more, places also, I'm afraid, where they wish I'd said less. And I think that's endemic in what this book is trying to do, because The Shadow of God tries to be both a work of philosophy and a work of history. And that raises methodological questions about how the two things go together. So if you think of ways in which people put together history and philosophy, one way would be if you thought that philosophy encompassed a strong, ongoing, intrinsic progress of reason, which somehow extended outwards to include history and society. And the most famous embodiment of that, of course, is Hegel, but you find it in other places, and most famously in contemporary philosophy. I think it's not an unfair way of representing the work of the German philosopher Jürgen Habermas. And another way is to say, well, the reason that history and philosophy go together is that philosophy is really just an expression or a product of an epiphenomenon of social processes that are going on elsewhere. And the most famous representative of that, of course, is Karl Marx. And this book, as you will find if you read it, takes neither of those views. It doesn't see philosophy as having some overarching rationality, nor does it see philosophy as merely a byproduct of processes going on elsewhere. So one big question is how the two go together. And in general, what the book thinks is that that all societies need to offer their members ways of making sense of the world in the face of the unpalatable facts of death and suffering that all human beings face. So that's a kind of standing problem that all societies have. And you can look at philosophy as a quote from Goethe. Goethe calls philosophy a Lebensform, a form of life, and a way of coming to terms with the world. Mit der Welt fertig werden in German. And that, I think, is the point of coupling that the book tries to use to bring philosophy and society, social understanding together. Now that's, as I say, extremely abstract, but it's perhaps worth bearing in mind as a way of understanding what I'm about to say. Well, as its title makes clear, The Shadow of God is a book about secularization. And the title itself comes from Nietzsche. Nietzsche has a little passage in his book, The Gay Science, in which he tells a story about the Buddha. The Buddha, he says, was meditating in a cave. And after he left this cave, the shadow of the Buddha remained on the cave. And, says Nietzsche, that's the situation we're in with God. God is dead, but his shadow remains. And Nietzsche says we must vanquish the shadow. Now, already that is really rather puzzling. Because, for Nietzsche, God was always a kind of shadow. It wasn't that there was really God and that God disappeared. And why should one want to vanquish a shadow? Is it because we have to live in some ideal of rational clarity without any forms of ideals or unfounded beliefs at all? So that's at least one problem that we need to think about. But the book doesn't treat secularization in the conventional way. If you read books about secularization, most of them have something like an external explanation for what they see as the decline of religion. Some of it is sociological, it's about industrialization, it's about urbanization, it's about the increase of affluence, and so on and so forth. Others, and often connected, have to do with the rise of a technological civilization, the rise of modern science, and it treats then as it were the tide coming in on an institution which really isn't itself subject to secularizing processes. Whereas this book looks at secularization, as I would say, endogenously, from the point of view of the tension between faith and reason in monotheistic religion itself. And it looks at Kant and Hegel and the German idealists as embodying, let's say, a final effort to bring together faith and reason in the project of rational theology. And that leads us to the great problem of rational theology, the justification of the goodness of the world in the face of the existence of apparent evil. If you have a God who is all-powerful, benevolent, and all-knowing, how is it that the world seems to have evil in it? And that is, I'm sure you know, is the problem of theodicy. Now, theodicy, the book argues, has a broad and a narrow form. On one level, it's the problem of how a good and omnipotent God could allow the apparent evil in the world. But more broadly, and this brings me back to what I was saying right at the beginning, it's how can people find their place in the world acceptable, the facts of death and suffering notwithstanding. Now, the basic moves by which the Western tradition has responded to this problem of evil can be relatively easily summarized. And the dominant answer from the time of the book of Genesis was the story of the fall of man. The idea that death and suffering were just punishments for original sin. But that answer has its problems, as I'm sure you know. Whose sin is being punished? Adam's and Eve's? If so, then the question is, why should a just God punish us for the sinful actions of someone who's simply our very remote ancestor? And in the modern world, in the early modern world, we can see that that view came to be challenged, though never completely replaced, by another view which is, speaking technically, optimistic. The idea that we live in a world whose laws have been organized for the benefit, that's to say, the happiness of mankind. So where the story of original sin led us to doubt God's benevolence, because why does he punish us, apparently unjustly, optimism starts to lead to the problem about God's omnipotence. Is that really as good as things get, or could get? And that's why it's often said that theodicy came to an end with the Lisbon earthquake. That's a Lisbon earthquake looking very dramatic. I suppose you probably know that the Lisbon earthquake wasn't an earthquake, it was a tsunami. So the earthquake was in fact off the shores of the Atlantic. So this fanciful picture of all the things raining down from the heavens can't have been accurate. The seas invading the streets of Lisbon certainly was. It was a feast day and the churches were packed, so anyone who didn't go to church had a better chance of surviving than the pious who did. And it was the great shock for the 18th century, the great source of debate. Voltaire, of course, satirized it famously in Candide. There were various attempts to push back, but it was said, it has been said, that this put the end to theodicy as it had been understood as God, because it's very hard to think that you couldn't have so ordered the world that things like this wouldn't have happened. Now, that's where I get to the start of the argument of this book, because as I argue, as I think I show, Kant develops a very distinctive post-Lisbon theodicy. And his theodicy is centered on human agency and responsibility. So if the world is good, it's good for Kant not because it produces the greatest amount of human well-being, happiness, but because it gives human beings freedom. Life in this world consists in living a life of freedom, but at the same time, it's oriented towards an afterlife of reward and punishment by a just God. This is a very important thing for me to argue because the mainstream of modern Kant interpretation very much underplays that part of Kant's writing. So I have a quote which I use in the book probably several times. I use it because it's one that I never ran across in any of the readings that I did of the secondary literature on Kant. So I give it to you. It is from the necessity of punishment that the inference to a future life is drawn, which is the most amazing thing to say, because if we think of heaven, we generally think of it as a place of reward rather than a place of punishment. But for Kant, it would be good of God to give good people happiness, but it would be unjust of God if bad people, evil people, were not punished. So that is a very different image of Kant than the one that dominates modern Kant scholarship, particularly those who are taught or inspired by John Rawls. Now, the Kant I depict then is not a secular thinker. Theism is at the very heart of what he does. But that means three things. First of all, human beings have to know what's required of them. If God is just, human beings can't be dependent for moral knowledge on the intricate moral reasoning of a sophisticated modern moral philosopher like Judith Jarvis Thomson, Baroness Honora O'Neill, Francis Cam, or John Rawls. Each of us, even the most uneducated, carries within ourselves what he calls die gemeine Menschenvernunft, common human reason. And armed with that, he says, we've got no need of science and philosophy to know what one has to do in order to be honest and good, and even wise and virtuous. So that is important because not only does everyone carry it in them, whether they're educated or studied philosophy or not, but it looks as though it has to be the same for all people at all times and all places. It's a common feature of all human beings that we share basic ideas about morality. I'm happy to talk more about that, but I have to move on. So the moral reason that we share isn't some kind of calculating algorithm that applies an objective test to resolve moral dilemmas. Instead, it draws on the notion of treating an intrinsic inviolable value, the personhood or humanity in one's persons that we all have, with appropriate respect. So Kant's moral philosophy doesn't have that algorithmic quality, and turning that idea of respecting that personhood, dignity into ethical judgments would require a lot of, to modern readers, often strange intuitions, as well as teleological thinking about human beings and their conditions. So that's one reason why a lot of Kant's own moral judgments seem to be so far at variance with most of our own modern moral judgments, including that of many of those who regard themselves as Kant's modern successors. Another thing, though, apart from being shared by us, morality has to be something whose goodness doesn't come from the command of another being, however powerful. In fact, it's something that's shared between human beings and the divine. So Kant takes, I argue, a very strong line on a dilemma which goes all the way back to Plato, the Euthyphro dilemma. Now, the Euthyphro dilemma, very, very briefly, in a dialogue called the Euthyphro, it's only 3,000 words long, Euthyphro is off to prosecute his father for murder. And he stops off, as one does, to have a chat about philosophy on the way. And in the course, they discuss the issue, is something pious because the gods love it, or do the gods love it because it's pious? And it's not surprising that Plato, through Socrates, comes down very strongly on the side of saying the gods love it because it is pious, rather than it being pious because the gods love it. And mutating the mutans, turning that into modern parlance, Kant is on Plato's side. Morality is not something that takes its goodness from God's command, but God is, and I'll say a little bit more about this, morality is of God's essence. So it's not something simply commanded by him. And that also means, justice means, that human beings have to be able to follow or not the commands of morality freely. They really must have a choice. So those three things give you a very firm picture of Kant. So for Kant, God doesn't establish the moral law by decree. He is, he says, a constitutional monarch. And nor does God make a decision to obey the moral law himself. In fact, the moral law expresses God's own nature. And in that way, and this is a very complicated thought that I'm going to give you very quickly, it isn't a limitation on his freedom. When we say that a law is binding on us, it's binding because Kant thinks, and this is very reasonable, it comes from outside us. It's given to us as a principle or an injunction. But something that comes from inside us, even if it is necessary, isn't thereby a limitation on our freedom. And this is a really deep and difficult thought, which, as it happens, runs through the whole of German idealism. And the person who puts it most succinctly and clearly, I think, is Friedrich Wilhelm Joseph Schelling, who writes, "A being is free which acts according to the laws of its own essence and is not determined by anything else either within or outside itself." And that corresponds to the Kantian idea of autonomy. So human freedom, however, is the law of human beings' essence only if we can take morality to be the essence of human identity. So the word autonomy has two parts, autos, nomos, self and law. And the problem is that Kantian autonomy threatens to shrink the autos into the nomos. It threatens to be the identification of human beings with moral agency alone. And yet, at the same time, there's a tension in Kant. Because for Kant, the law always remains a command. It isn't something that comes from our nature spontaneously. Indeed, another great thinker of the time, Friedrich Schiller, the poet and playwright, but also very considerable philosopher, wrote a book called On Grace and Dignity, in which he had tried to sort of bridge the gap between Kant and his critics by saying, look, there are two ways in which you can be moral. You could be moral spontaneously, in which morality comes from your own nature. And in that case, there's no struggle. You have grace. On the other hand, it could be something that you have to struggle with, in which case it's expressed in dignity. And Kant, cursed are the peacemakers as always, Kant twice pushes back strongly against this and says, look, I accept what he says about dignity, but if it were graceful, it would have no real moral merit. We can't simply be moral beings all the way through. So that explains a good deal of the tension of what a lot of the interpretation of this book is about. However, there's time to put it into a slightly wider context, because this drive for explanation that we find in Kant, this is all part of a wider project of a drive for justification. So for Kant, reason operates, as he puts it, as a law court. So all of this is aimed against any picture which would have human beings as the plaything of alien forces. They have to have independence, not just from the causal order of the world, but even from the commands of a deity, to the extent that those commands are simply a matter of arbitrary authority. And so my central claim is that although Kant isn't a secular thinker, he turns out to be, nevertheless, a secularizing one. And that's shown very clearly in this way that the gap between God and man is closed. The Kantian God doesn't offer human beings the gift of grace, nor does he override justice by exercising divine mercy. To make either of those things possible would make God much warmer, but it would, at the same time, introduce an element of arbitrariness. It would, in Kant's view, make God unjust. So the Kantian God becomes depersonalized. And that isn't as a result of Kant moving away from his theistic commitments, but of him pursuing them so relentlessly. That's how faith and reason start to come into tension. And you can see Kant's philosophy as a kind of embodiment of a kind of bourgeois heroism, an uncompromising campaign against the alienation that would come from arbitrariness. Now, Iris Murdoch, in her very famous essay, The Sovereignty of Good, identified Kant as a rebel like Milton's Satan. Now, I think that's, in one way, completely wrong. There could never have been a less Kantian phrase than, evil be thou my good. But on the other hand, she has her finger on something that was very important. Namely, to the extent that human beings had been consoled by the thought that they stood in relation to a personal deity who had them under his paternal care. Of course, our Father, which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. That's where the Christian faith starts. Kantianism is a source of alienation too. So it's a struggle against the alienation that comes from arbitrariness and a lack of justification, of being the plaything of alien forces in that way, but it leads to an alienation of loneliness. And I think, there's huge amounts more to say, but I'm going to keep cracking on because I can be unfair to let James have his go. But that, I can't resist saying that seems to me to reveal something very deep about our modern situation. Those of us who've read Kafka, and I think that must be everyone, will remember that the nightmarish quality of Kafka is the picture of us suffering from both kinds of alienation, of being in a world which lacks both the transparency of justification and the warmth and immediacy of human relations. And the struggle to try and keep both of those things does seem to me to be a really profound defining feature of the modern world. But alongside all of this orientation to divine judgment and the afterlife and the primacy of punishment that I've just been talking about, we can also find in Kant something else. And that's the idea that human beings should see themselves as participating in a shared collective project that exists throughout history, the realization of justice. And that he calls, and again it's a theological reference, an invisible church. Now, to see ourselves as a part of an invisible church is to see ourselves as transcending ourselves by being engaged in a project which goes beyond our own existence. I call that idea historical immortality in the book, and it runs through German idealism. The idealist goal was, in the words of the old assistance program of German idealism, the absolute freedom of all spirits which carry the intellectual world in themselves and which may not seek God or immortality outside themselves. And the young Hegel wrote to the even younger Schelling, oh, here we are, here's the ethical community, in the 1790s, reason and freedom remain our watchword and our rallying point, the church invisible. Now, this idea of historical immortality wasn't confined to the idealists. In the 1760s, for example, the Enlightenment philosophe Diderot had already asserted the assumed supreme importance of posterity for giving the world we live in meaning. He wrote in a letter to his friend Falconet, posterity for the philosophe is the other world of the religious man. And I think historical immortality has had very deep consequences. Its presence is everywhere in the revolutionary, conservative, progressive and nationalist movements of the 19th and 20th century. You can see it obviously in the Marxian idea of emancipation and revolutionary struggle, in the idea of the revolutionary as a dedicated person who will accept martyrdom for the sake of the cause. You can find it in nationalism, very obviously, creepily, but I think very clearly, it's there in racism. If you think of one of the most horrifying features of the 20th century, the Nazis, even at a time when they certainly knew that they were losing the war, didn't ratchet down and put resources away from their attempt to exterminate the Jews. They actually ratcheted it up. And if you believe that racial destiny is the ultimate goal of your activities, that makes an awful kind of sense. At any rate, I'm going to wrap up now, at last, by mentioning Theodor Adorno, who, of course, wrote very much in the shadow of Auschwitz, and in a certain way, this book was written backwards from this quote of Adorno's. The Lisbon earthquake was enough to cure Voltaire of the Leibnizian theodicy, and that comprehensible catastrophe of first nature was insignificant compared with the second social one that escapes the human imagination in making a real hell from human evil. Now, I don't know if this is the way that Adorno would have interpreted it himself, but what he says is very puzzling, because human evil is old news. When Pope wrote in his essay of Man, if flood or earthquake break not heaven's design, why then a Borgia or a Catiline? Human beings, it's part of the system of theological thought that human beings have fallen away from goodness. So why should that be disturbing? Well, it's disturbing if you think that the story that I'm telling in this book is right, and to a great extent, the idea of heaven and hell, judgment by a divine judge, has been replaced by ideas of historical immortality, the idea of humankind as being engaged in some kind of collective project. And I read Adorno as saying Auschwitz calls into question our faith in that kind of belief in historical immortality. Okay, well, I hope you think that there are lots and lots of things that I've said now which raise lots and lots more questions. I'm sure that's absolutely right, but I ought to stop and now at last allow James to come and ask some of his.